Late 1967. Somewhere in the Laotian panhandle, a political officer of the North Vietnamese Army's 559th Transportation Group is sitting in a bamboo-framed headquarters, reading a circular he has just received from Hanoi. He reads it once, then he reads it again. The circular does not describe an American advance. It does not report a bombing strike or a lost convoy. It describes something the Vietnamese People's Army, 6 years into supplying one of the most sophisticated guerrilla campaigns in the 20th century, has decided requires urgent official explanation: their own ammunition. Certain lots of AK-47 rounds, the circular explains, appear to be exploding in the chamber when fired. Not misfiring, not jamming, exploding. Troops experiencing weapon failures should report them immediately. Political officers should explain that the defective rounds are the result of manufacturing errors at certain Chinese and Soviet factories. Morale should be maintained. The political officer sets the circular down. He is a professional. He has been doing this for years. He recognizes, in the careful language of that document, something it cannot say directly. His soldiers are afraid of their own weapons, and somebody has made them afraid on purpose. He was right about that. He would never learn the rest. The force responsible for what he was reading was never supposed to exist in the conventional sense of military organizations. It had no acknowledged presence in the countries where most of its operations were conducted. Its budget was classified. Its casualties, when they occurred in places the United States government officially denied any American soldiers were operating, were documented in files that would not be declassified for 2 decades. When the men who served in it came home, they did not talk about where they had been or what they had done. Many of them still have not. The organization was the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG. The name is worth pausing on because it is one of the finest pieces of misdirection in American military history. Studies and Observations Group implies clipboard holders. It implies filing clerks and analysts working in air-conditioned offices in Saigon, tallying figures and writing memos. The name is so bureaucratic it makes your eyes slide over it. That was the intention. What it actually was: the most heavily decorated unit per capita in the Vietnam War. A covert special operations force, running teams into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam at a time when American forces were officially not present in any of those places. A unit where 12 men in the right stretch of jungle, on the right night, could make a logistics organization of 50,000 people, change its procedures, destroy its own supply caches, and eventually start burning its own operational maps. This is the story of how they did that. And it is not primarily a story about firefights or helicopter extractions, though there are plenty of both. It is a story about what happens to an enemy's decision-making when he can no longer trust the information he has generated himself, when his own intelligence apparatus becomes something he is afraid of. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow, we've got something special lined up just for you. The German generals who fought in the Ardennes in December 1944 called American maps unfair because the Americans knew German-administered territory better than the Germans did. The NVA commanders in the Laotian panhandle would face something stranger: the discovery that an enemy they could rarely see had made their own maps unreliable. The maps they had built, and in territory they controlled, of infrastructure they had constructed with years of labor in some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. To understand how that happened, you have to start at the beginning, with what SOG actually was, and who it sent into the jungle. MACV-SOG was activated on January 24, 1964, 9 months before the first American combat units landed at Da Nang. Its activation order granted authority to conduct operations the United States could plausibly deny. The language was specific enough to be meaningful, and vague enough to be deniable. Both qualities were intentional. At peak strength, SOG ran roughly 2,000 American personnel and 8,000 indigenous fighters. The indigenous forces came primarily from Montagnard tribes of the Vietnamese highlands, ethnic minorities who had been fighting for their land long before any American arrived, and who were, in the judgment of every SOG commander who worked alongside them, among the most capable soldiers the United States encountered in Southeast Asia. The Montagnards called their American counterparts Bok Si, something close to elder brothers. The men who served with them still use that word. The fundamental unit of operations was the recon team, abbreviated RT. A standard RT consisted of 3 Americans and between 6 and 9 indigenous soldiers. The teams had state designations: RT Idaho, RT Texas, RT Florida, RT Nevada. The size was deliberate. In the Laotian panhandle and the Cambodian border regions where most SOG operations ran, a large formation was a liability. 12 men who moved carefully could go places a battalion could not. What they were going to were 3 broad categories of target. The first was the Ho Chi Minh Trail itself, the logistics network the North Vietnamese had built through Laos and Cambodia to supply their forces in the south. The trail was not a single road. It was a system of roads, paths, river crossings, storage facilities, and headquarters, maintained by the 509th Transportation Group, which at its peak employed roughly 50,000 people. The 509th kept detailed operational maps of every segment of the system. Those maps, updated continuously as the trail expanded and rerouted, were among the most carefully guarded documents in the North Vietnamese military. The second category was the numbered base areas, sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia, where North Vietnamese units rested, resupplied, and planned. Base Area 604, Base Area 611, Base Area 353. The numbers were American designations. To the NVA, they were rear areas, places beyond the reach of American ground forces, safe by treaty, and by geography, and by the assumption that nobody was going to walk there. The third category was anything that would tell the American command what was moving, where it was going, and how much of it there was. The men who ran these teams did not fit any pattern the Army normally produced. Sergeant Major Billy Waugh had been in uniform since the Korean War and would remain operational into his mid-60s. Staff Sergeant Jerry Shriver, known to everyone who served with him as Mad Dog, would sometimes leave his team's perimeter alone to scout positions that needed scouting. Nobody ordered it. Waiting struck him as inefficient. Sergeant Bob Howard was wounded 14 times in Vietnam. He received the Medal of Honor for an action on December 30, 1968, in Cambodia, a country where he was officially not present, pinned by President Nixon 2 years after the fact. These men were not conventional soldiers given unconventional assignments. They were something the Army did not have a category for, and the Army was somewhat nervous about this, and the Army was right. The teams operated under radio call signs. They were inserted by helicopter at last light, into landing zones chosen because they were dangerous enough that the NVA would not post sentinels on them. They moved at night. They observed during the day. When they were found, and being found was a professional probability rather than a personal failure, they had extraction procedures built on speed, violence, and air support, and the kind of decision-making that happens in fractions of a second when someone is shooting at you from 3 directions simultaneously. But surveillance and direct action were only 2 of the things SOG was running in the jungle. The third program was something that had never been attempted at this scale, something the NVA would not fully understand for months. Something that, when they finally did understand it, produced a documented response so dramatic and so self-defeating that American analysts reading the captured intelligence had to go back through the translations to believe what they said. The program had multiple names across its operational life. In classified documents, it appeared as Project Eldest Son, and later as Italian Green. The men who knew about it, and not many did, called it the bad stuff. The concept was this: the North Vietnamese military was supplied with weapons and ammunition manufactured primarily in China and the Soviet Union. The standard infantry weapon was the AK-47, firing 7.62 by 39mm ammunition. Standard support weapons included the RPG-2 rocket launcher, the 82mm mortar, and various crew-served machine guns, all firing ammunition that traveled south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in sealed crates, moving by truck, by bicycle, and on the backs of porters through the Laotian panhandle. Someone in the SOG planning apparatus observed that this supply chain had a property that could be worked. The NVA soldier in the field had no way to verify the provenance of his ammunition. He received it from a supply point. The supply point received it from a depot. The depot received it from a truck. The truck received it from a warehouse. At no point in that chain did anyone open the cartridges and inspect the propellant charge. There was no reason to. The cases were sealed. The markings were standard. The ammunition looked like ammunition. The plan was to manufacture visually identical rounds loaded with modified charges. Modified in the specific sense that when the cartridge was fired, the overpressure generated would rupture the receiver of the weapon, destroying it and wounding or killing the man holding it. The same principle applied to RPG rounds. Applied to mortar rounds, where a malfunction does not damage a rifle, but detonates inside a tube next to the faces of a three-man crew. Then introduce these rounds into the NVA supply chain, at points where they could not be distinguished from legitimate stock. The technical execution required ammunition that was dimensionally identical to factory production, that functioned correctly on visual inspection, and that would survive storage and handling without premature detonation. The production was handled in the United States. The casings were correct. The bullets were correct weight and caliber. The propellant was not. SOG teams carried this ammunition into the field and seeded it into captured NVA supply caches, ammunition storage points, and weapons depots. They moved through areas they had already reconnoitered, left the rounds in places where NVA resupply personnel would find and redistribute them into the normal flow, and extracted without contact. The rounds then moved through the supply chain on their own, indistinguishable from everything around them. The first documented NVA response appeared in a captured document in late 1967, a political officer's circular directing subordinates to attribute weapon explosions to manufacturing defects, to explain to troops that Chinese and Soviet factories occasionally produced substandard lots, to collect damaged weapons for inspection, to maintain unit morale. You do not issue that document unless the weapon explosions are happening frequently enough to require official explanation. You do not direct political officers to address morale unless the morale problem is real and spreading. The second documented response came in 1968. A 559th Transportation Group order directed ammunition handlers to inspect all received stocks before distribution and specified what signs of tampering to look for. The order acknowledged, in the careful language of a classified military circular, that enemy forces had been introducing defective ammunition into North Vietnamese supply points. The NVA had correctly identified the problem. What the circular could not tell its recipients was how to solve it, because the solution required knowing which lots were contaminated, and there was no reliable way to know. A sealed crate of AK-47 ammunition, sitting in a Laotian supply depot, stamped with Chinese factory markings, looked exactly like every other sealed crate of AK-47 ammunition in every other Laotian supply depot. Most of those crates had never been touched. Some had been opened, the legitimate rounds removed, and Eldest Son ammunition substituted. From the outside, they were the same object. The NVA response to that uncertainty was the most expensive possible one. Entire lots were quarantined. Supply depots stopped distributing received stocks pending inspection, slowing the flow through the trail by weeks. Some field commanders, unable to determine which ammunition was safe, began returning stocks to rear depots rather than issuing them to their units. American signals intelligence indicated that certain NVA units were running short of small arms ammunition. The trail had not been cut. Their own supply officers had stopped trusting what the trail was delivering. A 1968 Defense Intelligence Agency assessment concluded that Eldest Son had caused the North Vietnamese to destroy or quarantine ammunition stocks worth several $1 million, and had produced, in the language of the assessment, significant degradation of enemy confidence in indigenous supply systems. Significant degradation of enemy confidence in indigenous supply systems. That is the bureaucratic phrasing for, we made them afraid of their own weapons. And that fear propagated up the supply chain until it began damaging the supply chain from the inside. But Eldest Son was one program. While it ran, the recon teams were doing something to the NVA's operational picture that would eventually produce the moment this whole story is building toward. The moment a commander looks at his own operational map and decides that burning it is the safer choice. Every share of this video reaches someone who doesn't know this story yet. That matters more than you might think for keeping it in the record. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. SOG teams running into Laos under the Prairie Fire operational designation had a specific intelligence mission beyond what they were directed to observe during any single operation. They were building, over time, a picture of the 559th's administrative infrastructure. The road watchers and traffic counters were valuable. The headquarters locations were more valuable. The maps that showed the complete routing of the trail, annotated with depot positions and way station coordinates and underground facility locations, were the most valuable material in the Laotian panhandle. A captured set of 559th operational maps would tell American planners more about the trail than months of aerial reconnaissance, because those maps showed not just where the roads ran, but where the hidden facilities were: the underground fuel storage, the camouflaged truck parks, the maintenance depots buried in the hillsides of the Annamite Range. The 509th had spent years building things that could not be seen from above. They had built them to be invisible, and by the standard measures of reconnaissance, they were. By 1968, American targeting was finding 559th facilities that should have been invisible, underground storage areas with no surface signature, maintenance depots built specifically to defeat aerial photography, administrative centers, the planning offices of the 559th command staff, were being located and struck with a frequency that the 559th security protocols could not account for. The initial assumption was better aerial reconnaissance. American SR-71 and smaller reconnaissance platforms flying over Laos could detect certain surface indicators: the worn path to a hidden entrance, the pattern of foot traffic around a camouflaged facility, the subtle compression of vegetation above a buried fuel tank. This explains some of the targeting. Not all of it. The other part was recon teams who had walked up to those facilities on foot, looked at them, and walked away. The teams were finding things aerial photography could not see because they were on the ground. A recon team moving carefully through Laotian jungle could identify a facility built specifically to defeat overhead observation, simply by getting close enough to smell diesel fuel, hear a generator, notice the commo wire stapled to the back of a tree. The teams rarely engaged what they found. Observe, report, extract, and let air assets do the work. But the NVA's operational problem was not the strikes themselves. Their problem was that they could not determine which of their facilities had been seen by a team and which had not. A team operating in a sector might have located the depot in a particular grid square, or it might have passed 2 kilometers south and seen nothing. The operational maps did not say. The security logs did not say. The only people who knew exactly what a team had observed were the team members themselves, and they were already on an airfield in Thailand. This created a planning problem the 559th had no doctrine for. If a facility might have been observed, what do you do with it? You can move it, which costs weeks of labor and disrupts supply flow. You can keep using it and accept the risk of a precision strike. Or you can destroy it yourself, preemptively, eliminating whatever intelligence value it holds, and rebuild somewhere else. Captured 559th documents from 1968 and 1969 show all 3 responses occurring simultaneously in different sectors of the trail system. Some facilities were maintained, some were relocated, and some were preemptively destroyed by their own administrators, including, in several documented cases, the destruction of the operational maps and records stored at those facilities before personnel evacuated. That last category is the one that matters here. The 559th was destroying its own records, not because American forces had arrived to capture them. They were destroying them because American forces might arrive, and there was no time to determine what a team had already seen, and the records could not be allowed to fall into American hands. In their own rear area, in territory they had built and controlled for years, the North Vietnamese Logistics Command was destroying its own operational maps because it could not calculate the risk of keeping them. By 1969, CHOG was running approximately 500 recon missions per year into denied territory. The cumulative intelligence picture building in Saigon, and at 7th Air Force Headquarters at Nakhon Phanom, was, by the assessment of senior American commanders who had access to it, the most detailed understanding any outside power had developed of the Ho Chi Minh Trail since the 559th began constructing it in 1959. But the intelligence product was not the most operationally significant thing the teams were producing. The most significant thing was what was happening to the NVA's own picture. The NVA's planning system depended on certainty about rear areas. The trail was not just a logistics route. It was a safe zone where units rested, where commanders planned without looking over their shoulders, where the administrative machinery of a large military force could function on timelines measured in weeks and months. The certainty of that safety was itself a resource, as real and as finite as ammunition or fuel. It allowed the 559th to plan at scale. It allowed NVA units to concentrate in base areas without tactical dispersion. It allowed commanders to maintain complete records and detailed maps because those records were, by definition, beyond reach. SOG removed that certainty. Not everywhere, and not absolutely, but enough, and for long enough, that the effects compounded. NVA after-action reports and captured command documents from this period show a pattern of responses that, individually, look like reasonable security precautions. Taken together, they describe an organization that has stopped trusting its own procedures. Headquarters were moved more frequently, which meant maps had to be updated more frequently, which meant the operational picture was always slightly behind current conditions. Facilities were camouflaged more aggressively, which made them harder for NVA supply personnel to locate, as well as for American reconnaissance teams. Communication security was tightened, which slowed the internal information flow the 559th needed to manage trail throughput. Ammunition stocks were quarantined and inspected, which delayed distribution. Maps and documents were classified at higher levels, which reduced the number of personnel with access to the complete picture of what the system looked like. Each of these responses was rational. Each made the 559th slightly less efficient. Together, they made it substantially less effective. There is a captured NVA political officer's report from late 1968 that a Defense Intelligence Agency translator pulled from a batch of documents recovered after an operation in the Panhandle. The author describes the psychological state of personnel at a 559th way station. He frames it, professionally, as an ideological problem. The men lack revolutionary commitment. They require political education. He is requesting materials. What the report actually describes is personnel who are reluctant to fire their weapons during security incidents because of weapon reliability concerns, and reluctant to remain in facilities that have shown any sign of having been observed. They are requesting transfers to units operating in less sensitive areas. These were not men who had been broken by combat. They were men making rational individual decisions based on the risk environment they were in. That risk environment had been constructed, in large part, by programs they would never know the specifics of. They were afraid of their weapons because of Eldest Son. They were afraid of their positions because of the teams. They were destroying their own maps as a precaution, because leaving behind a complete record of what the 559th had built, and where, was a risk no standing order had taught them how to calculate. The SOG teams had not physically occupied those positions. They had simply been in the area, or might have been, and the might was enough. They had become ghosts in the enemy's rear. In a sense, those 559th personnel could not have articulated. The teams were not everywhere. The NVA simply could not prove they weren't. There is a category of military effectiveness that does not appear on any monument. You cannot measure it in enemy dead or terrain seized. You measure it in decisions an enemy does not make, in operations an enemy does not attempt. In facilities, an enemy destroys himself before anyone arrives to capture them. SOG's casualty rate was among the highest of any American unit in Vietnam. Roughly a quarter of the Americans who served in the program became casualties over its operational life. The Montagnards and other indigenous fighters who ran with the teams paid an even higher proportional price. The program produced targeting intelligence that shaped American air operations over Laos for years. Eldest Son is still examined in special operations programs as a case study in simultaneous psychological and material disruption through a single program. But the measure that matters for this story is the simpler one. At some point in 1968 or 1969, somewhere in the Laotian Panhandle or the Cambodian highlands, an NVA officer opened his map case, looked at the operational maps inside, and made a decision that had nothing to do with where to move his forces. He was deciding whether to keep the maps at all. Those maps showed positions he had built, routes he had cut, facilities his people had constructed through years of exhausting labor. They were the record of the work that had supplied an army for a decade, and he burned them. Because the alternative was not knowing whether an American had already walked close enough to note what they showed, and the uncertainty of that not knowing was greater than the loss of the record itself. This is the same logic that German staff officers confronted in December 1944 when they examined a captured American map of their own positions and reached for the word unfair. The same structure, a force had become so capable of seeing what should not be seeable that the defender's response was to destroy his own picture of his own defenses. The home team, in territory it controlled and had built, was less certain about what the enemy knew than the enemy was. The German generals complained that the Americans knew German-administered territory better than the Germans did. The NVA commanders in the Panhandle faced something more intimate: the possibility that a team of 12 men had walked through their own rear area, looked at what they had built, and walked out again without anyone knowing what had been seen. MACV-SOG was disbanded in 1972. Its records were classified. Its casualties in Laos and Cambodia were, for years, not officially acknowledged, because the men had died in countries where they were not supposed to be. The Montagnards who fought alongside the teams were largely abandoned when American forces withdrew. That is a chapter that belongs in a longer and harder piece than this one. Staff Sergeant Jerry Shriver was listed missing in action after an operation on April 24, 1969, in Cambodia. He was 27 years old. He has never been found. Sergeant First Class Bob Howard received the Medal of Honor that President Nixon presented in 1971 for actions that had taken place 3 years earlier in a country neither man was authorized to acknowledge. Billy Waugh continued working for the CIA after the Army, still operational into his 60s. Major John Plaster, who served 3 tours with SOG and later wrote the most comprehensive account of the program available to the public, described the cumulative achievement with the flatness of a man who was there and does not need drama to convey what he saw. "We went where no one else went," he wrote. "We did what no one else could do. And the enemy knew it, even when they didn't know it was us." That last clause is the part that matters. The political officer reading the circular about weapon malfunctions did not know about Eldest Son. The 559th Headquarters staff, burning their maps before evacuating a compromised facility, did not know which specific team had found them or what exactly had been reported. The company commander calling for transfers to less sensitive areas did not know that the risk environment he was trying to escape had been built deliberately, over years, by a program he had never heard of. They knew only the effects. The weapon that exploded in careful hands. The facility struck a week after it had seemed secure. The uncertainty spreading outward from a team sighting like a stain through the administrative machinery of an organization that depended on certainty to function. That uncertainty was what SOG built. Not the intelligence reports, not the individual strikes, not the disruption to any single supply shipment. The uncertainty itself, pooling in the places where the 559th made decisions, was the product. And somewhere in that jungle, a man stood with his own operational maps in his hands, and did the thing this story was always moving toward. He burned them. That is what 12 men can do. If you've been watching this channel for a while, and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.
German soldiers were trained to count shots. Bolt-action rifles forced rhythm into battle. Fire, cycle, fire again. But when Americans appeared with the M1 Garand, that rhythm collapsed. The shots came too fast, too steady, too confident. It felt less like facing infantry and more like walking into a wall that never paused. German units often hesitated, waiting for a reload that never came. And that hesitation cost lives. The reason the M1 Garand earned such resentment wasn't its power or its range. It was the way it erased the brief moments of silence soldiers depended on to survive. And once those moments were gone, fear filled the gap. By the early 20th century, infantry warfare was changing faster than most armies were willing to admit. Bolt-action rifles had defined combat for decades, but World War I exposed their limits. Battles were no longer won by careful marksmanship alone. They were defeated by firepower, suppression, and momentum. Soldiers needed to fire quickly without breaking their position to reload, and that reality pushed the U.S. Army to search for something radically different, a reliable semi-automatic service rifle. That challenge landed in the hands of John Cantius Garand. Born in Quebec in 1888 and raised in the United States, Garand had no formal engineering degree, but he possessed something just as valuable: practical mechanical skill. From working in textile mills to tool-making shops, he learned forging, welding, and precision machining firsthand. His fascination with firearms grew alongside his talent for invention, eventually leading him to work on weapons design for the U.S. government. At Springfield Armory, Garand was tasked with replacing the aging M1903 bolt-action rifle. The requirements were strict. The new rifle had to be semi-automatic, durable, accurate, and capable of firing the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge. Most importantly, it had to function reliably in mud, dust, cold, and combat stress. Many designs were tested and discarded, including Garand's own early prototypes, which suffered from weak bolts and mechanical failures. Garand ultimately solved the problem with a gas-operated system. By redirecting a small amount of gas from each fired round, the rifle could automatically eject the spent casing and chamber the next cartridge. He paired this with an 8-round en-bloc clip, which fed smoothly into the gun and was ejected once empty. This design balanced simplicity, reliability, and speed, precisely what the Army needed. After years of trials and refinement, the rifle was officially standardized as the M1 in 1936. Production began slowly, but as global tensions rose, Springfield Armory dramatically expanded output. By World War II, millions of M1 Garands were being produced, turning Garand's once controversial idea into the standard weapon of the American infantry and permanently changing how wars were fought. The M1 Garand was built to do one thing exceptionally well: keep pressure on the enemy without pause. Its most important feature was its semi-automatic, gas-operated system, which allowed the rifle to reload itself after every shot. When a bullet was fired, gas from the explosion was redirected through a small port near the muzzle. That gas pushed a piston connected to the bolt, ejecting the empty casing and chambering the next round automatically. For American soldiers, this meant they could fire again immediately without touching the bolt. For German soldiers armed mainly with bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, this was a serious problem. Every shot they fired required a manual motion that broke aim and slowed their response. In a firefight, that difference quickly became overwhelming. The Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip added to this pressure. Instead of loading rounds one at a time,
Yard by yard,
soldiers inserted a full
bunker
clip and
by
were
bunker.
instantly ready to fire.
Shoop
Reloading
moved
was
with them.
fast,
His
simple,
leg had not
and
improved
consistent,
through the night.
even under stress.
He walked with difficulty.
German troops
He did
noticed
not
that
stay in
American
one
rifle
place.
fire rarely
He moved
paused
up
for
and down
long,
the line,
making it difficult
not
to
making
move or
speeches,
counterattack.
not issuing grand
The rifle's
orders,
proving power
stopping at
also
each
meant
position, looking at what was in front of them, telling the men what to do next. When a section of the line stalled, he went there. When a position ran low on ammunition, he found more. When a runner couldn't get through, he went himself. For 50 hours, that was his battle. Not the whole island, not the grand arc of the campaign. The next 50 yards. Then, the 50 after that. On the afternoon of the second day, the Marines crossed the airstrip. The airstrip that Shibazaki had built his entire defense to protect. The airstrip that was the reason any of them were there. They crossed.
This created a battlefield reality where Americans could apply constant pressure.
No celebration. There was the next bunker. On the evening of the second day, Colonel Merritt Edson, Chief of Staff of the 2nd Marine Division, Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal, came ashore to take overall command on the ground. He found Shoup still on his feet, wounded, gaunt, 50 hours without sleep, still there. Shoup handed over command without a word of protest and went back to commanding his regiment. There was still fighting left to do. 4,500 Japanese defenders had been on Betio when the battle began. 17 survived. 1,021 Marines were killed. 2,100 were wounded. On an island 2 miles long, in 76 hours. A correspondent named Robert Sherrod was on Betio when it ended. He filed his report for Time magazine on December 6, 1943. He wrote, "Last week, some 2,000 or 3,000 United States Marines, most of them now dead or wounded, gave the nation a name to stand beside those of Concord Bridge, the Alamo, and Belleau Wood. The name was Tarawa." Sherrod also filmed what he saw. The footage he brought back was so graphic: bodies in the water, bodies on the sand. The cost of 76 hours laid bare that the United States military refused to release it. The American public, they believed, was not ready to see what the war actually looked like. President Roosevelt personally reviewed the film. He overruled the decision. He said the American people deserved to know what their sons were being asked to do. With the Marines at Tarawa was released in early 1944. Audiences sat in silence. Some walked out. Some could not. After the battle, American officers walked Betio from end to end. They went through every pillbox, every trench, every reinforced firing position. Their assessment, written into the official record. The defenses were nearly perfect. The fields of fire were exactly right. The concrete was exactly thick enough. The gun positions were exactly where they needed to be. If the tide had risen, if the Higgins boats had crossed the reef as planned and put the Marines directly onto the beach under the full weight of those guns, the casualties would have been far worse. Shibazaki had not miscalculated the fortress. Or, what he had miscalculated was simpler than that. He had fought in China. He had studied the record, the Philippines, Wake Island, Bataan. He had read the intelligence assessments. He had built his fortress for the army those assessments described. He built it for men who would break. He did not build it for men who already knew they might die before they reached the sand, and came anyway. That was not in any intelligence report. That was not something you could calculate. The men who died at Tarawa did not die for nothing. Every lesson written in blood on that reef was paid forward. 9 underwater demolition teams were formed immediately after Tarawa. Men whose job was to swim in ahead of every future landing, map the reefs, cut the obstacles,
reduced
so the
effort,
next generation
and
of
sustained
Marines
fire.
would not have to wade
All
blind
principles
into
first
the same
proven by
water
the
that had
Grand.
killed so many here.
Germany's response
Those
also
teams
speaks
became the
volumes.
foundation of what is
Late war
today
developments
the
like
Navy
the
SEALs.
SCG-44
The pre-landing
reflected a desperate
bombardments at
attempt to
every
close the
island after
firepower
Tarawa
gap.
lasted
While
not hours,
revolutionary in its
but
own
weeks.
way, it was a
The
reaction
landing
to the
craft
new
were
reality the
redesigned.
Grand helped create.
The communication systems
Infantry
were
combat was
rebuilt.
becoming
The
faster,
tidal
more
reconnaissance was
aggressive, and more
overhauled
focused on
entirely.
individual
The blood
firepower.
on the reef at Tarawa
Beyond the
paid for
battlefield,
safer
the
landings
M1
at
Garand
Saipan,
became a symbol.
at
Its
Iwo Jima,
distinctive
at
clip ejection
Okinawa.
sound, solid
Tens
build,
of thousands
and
of men
wartime
came home who
reputation
might not
cemented its
have
place in history.
because of what happened
It
here.
remained in service for decades.
Shoup wrote one
and
line in
continued
his
to be
notebook
used in
after the
training,
battle was over.
competition, and
Not about the
ceremonial
fighting,
roles.
not about
For
the men
German
he had
soldiers,
lost,
the M1 Garand
not about the Medal of
represented
Honor
more
that
than a
was
weapon.
coming,
It
though he
represented
didn't know it
industrial
yet.
strength, modern
He
thinking,
wrote,
and a future of
I
warfare they
realize
were
that
forced
I
to
am
confront too
but a
soon.
bit of
That
chaff
is why
from
it
the
wasn't
threshing
just
of
feared,
life,
it was
blown into the
deeply
pages of
hated.
history by the
War isn't
unknown
just fought with
winds of
soldiers.
chance.
It's fought with ideas,
350
industry,
Marines
and
who
design.
died at Tarawa
The
have
M1
never been
Garand
found.
proved that a single
Most of
weapon
them were killed in the
built the
water
right way
in those
and produced
first
at scale
hours,
could
before
change how
anyone could
battles were
record
won
where they
and
fell.
how enemies felt
Some were
fighting
buried
them.
on the island,
For German
and their
soldiers,
graves were lost
it
when the
wasn't just
Seabees
another
came in
rifle.
after the battle
It
to
was
expand
pressure they
the
couldn't
airstrip.
escape.
The
If
one
you enjoyed this
Shibazaki had built
in-depth
to
look
keep
into
the
weapons
Americans
that made
out.
history, there are many
There are
more
teams still
stories
going
like
back
this
to
waiting
Betio
be
today,
told. Hit
still
subscribe,
searching.
stay with the channel,
350
and let's keep
names,
uncovering the moments
no
that
graves,
changed warfare
no
forever.
markers. But there are other places those men still exist. Not in archives, not in history books, at dinner tables. In the sentence a grandfather started and then stopped. In the name he said once, the name of a man who didn't come back, and never said again. In the story, your father told you that you have never heard anywhere else, because it isn't anywhere else. It only exists in you. If your father served, if your grandfather served, if someone in your family came home from the Pacific and brought something back with them that they never quite put down, leave it here. One sentence, one name, one island. Don't let it disappear.